Have you ever wondered what truly happens to the soul of an elderly person who dies alone? This is a question that, for many, carries an almost unbearable weight. Some imagine darkness, emptiness, or even abandonment in the final moment. But is that how things really unfold? Or is it that, on the contrary, there is a silent welcome, invisible to human eyes, but intensely and truly present? Edgar Cayce, the famous sleeping prophet, left surprising answers about this moment. Answers that, if understood, can change the way you view life and death. And before you think this is just theory or religion, let's walk together through accounts, experiences, and concepts that show something much deeper and perhaps much more comforting than any grim image our minds can create. Cayce said that no one truly dies alone. He affirmed that at the instant physical life ends, consciousness expands and begins to perceive presences that were previously invisible. Deceased family members, beloved friends, even protective spiritual figures, all would be there, forming a kind of bridge between this world and the next. This vision directly contrasts with the common idea of loneliness in death. And perhaps you're thinking, but what if the person didn't believe in this? What if they never spoke of spirituality? According to Cayce, the experience doesn't depend on belief. It happens because it's part of the soul's nature, just like being born and breathing. What changes is how each person perceives this moment, depending on their mental, emotional, and spiritual state in the final instance. Imagine an elderly person in a silent room, with no relatives nearby, no hands holding theirs. From a physical point of view, they might seem alone. But Cayce described that on a spiritual level, this moment is accompanied by a reception far more intense than any room full of people. He spoke of a light that is not just brightness, but consciousness, understanding, unconditional love. A presence that dissolves fears. The curious thing is that in his accounts, he described this reception not as something distant in time, but as something that begins even before the last breath, as if the spiritual world gradually approached, preparing the soul for the crossing. This means that while to an outside observer death seems abrupt, for the person experiencing it from within, it can be a process of meeting and reunion. This vision is so different from what we usually imagine that it's worth pondering how it affects our relationship with the fear of death. Because, let's face it, most people fear not only physical pain or the end of consciousness, but abandonment. The idea of dying alone stirs something primal within us, the fear of being forgotten, of not mattering. But if Cayce is right, this fear dissolves the moment the soul realizes it is not, never was, and never will be, truly alone. This perception brings a comforting detail. According to him, the meeting on the other side is always personalized. Each soul receives whom it needs to meet. For some, it will be the mother who passed decades ago. For others, a friend or even a pet. What matters is not the form, but the certainty of familiarity and welcome. Perhaps you wonder, but what about cases where someone dies abruptly without preparation, without awareness of what's happening? Cayce said that even in these cases there is an adjustment process. The spirit may feel confused in the first moments, but is quickly assisted. Spiritual assistance, he said, is immediate. There is no bureaucracy, no waiting list. There is care. And this care is not limited to guiding the soul to the other side, but also to calming it, to explaining what is happening, as if someone were saying, "It's okay, you're safe now." And that's where we realize something important. For Cayce, true abandonment does not exist in death. This perspective also leads us to rethink how we view those who passed alone. How many times do we hear comments full of sadness or even guilt? So-and-so died and no one was there with them. But if Cayce's words are true, this physical absence is not what defines the moment. Perhaps the person was more accompanied than we can imagine, surrounded by presences that our eyes cannot perceive. This does not mean that physical company is not important. Of course it is. Human touch, voice, gaze, all of it comforts. But it is not the only possible form of companionship. And here arises a question that might already be in your mind. If this spiritual assistance is real, why can't we perceive it while we're alive? Cayce explained that, in the physical body, our perception is limited, as if we were seeing the world through a small crack. We can only capture what is within a specific range of vibration. When the body begins to shut down, this range expands, allowing us to perceive dimensions that were previously out of reach. That's why so many people on their deathbeds report seeing loved ones or people in the room that others don't see. These accounts are not hallucinations in the common sense of the word, but signs that consciousness is shifting frequency. It is interesting to note that Cayce's description finds parallels in many spiritual traditions and even in modern research on near-death experiences. Doctors and nurses report that patients about to pass often talk to invisible people, describe scenes of light, feel sudden peace. Science may call this an effect of brain chemistry, but Cayce would say that it is the moment the soul begins to perceive what has always been there, just beyond the reach of physical sight. This is not to convince, but to invite you to reflect. What if loneliness in death is merely an illusion of those who remain? Upon understanding this possibility, something shifts within us. Not only do we lose some of the fear of our own end, but we also gain a new perspective on those who have already departed. We stop imagining that they left for an emptiness and begin to consider that perhaps they were received with more love than any of us have ever experienced in earthly life. And if that is true, there is no definitive loss, only a change of state, a transition. Cayce saw death not as a fall into nothingness, but as a return to a home the soul always knew, even if it had forgotten during physical life. And this leads us to an intriguing revelation, which he made a point of repeating: to die is not to separate from everything, it is to reunite with everything. And when we think of an elderly person who dies alone, perhaps what is happening is not a moment of emptiness, but the instant they are reunited with all those they loved. To an outsider, it seems like silence. To an insider, it is reunion. If we stop to think, Edgar Cayce's view is not just comforting, it is deeply transformative, because it changes the way we see life itself. If it is true that, in the final moment, there is no abandonment, then perhaps the fear of being alone no longer needs to paralyze us. But Cayce didn't speak of this merely to ease hearts. He also warned that how we live influences how we perceive the crossing. And here is an essential point. Death can be welcoming for everyone, but the experience of crossing it varies according to the soul's state. A person who lived in constant bitterness or extreme attachment to material things may find it harder to let go, not because the spiritual world rejects them, but because they themselves resist going. He described this as someone in a room full of open doors, but insisting on looking back at the door that leads to the past. On the other hand, one who lived with more detachment, more gratitude, and less resentment tends to cross smoothly. This idea overturns a rigid view of post-death punishment or reward. It's not about punishment, but about perception. That is, the initial heaven or hell each one encounters is, in fact, a reflection of their own inner state. And this is important for us to understand the elderly person who dies alone, because, according to Cayce, even if they are physically isolated, the type of spiritual encounter they will have will depend more on how they lived and how they face their departure than on external circumstances. This leads us to consider the question of consciousness at the moment of death. Many people imagine that consciousness simply extinguishes, like turning off a switch, but Cayce said that in many cases it becomes even clearer. He described the transition as taking off a heavy coat and suddenly feeling lighter, more awake. For some, this clarity is immediate. For others, it takes a little longer, like waking from a deep sleep. But in both cases, he affirmed that there is no absolute void where the soul is lost. Even when there is initial confusion, there is always someone or something to guide. Perhaps you are wondering, what if the person doesn't believe in any of this? What if they think there's nothing after? Cayce was emphatic. Disbelief does not prevent the experience. What can happen, according to him, is that the soul takes longer to understand that it still exists. In his readings, he recounted cases of people who, after death, did not realize they had passed on. They continued trying to live their routine, talking to family members who didn't respond, until little by little they accepted the new reality. And at that moment, They were guided to what he called spirit schools, places of learning and adaptation. This is not punishment but care. Care so that no one crosses over completely unprepared for the new phase. Here's a fascinating detail. Cayce said that the soul carries not only memories, but also bonds of affection and even unresolved emotional issues. Therefore, an elderly person who dies alone physically may first be received by those who were most emotionally important to them, regardless of kinship. It could be a childhood friend, a teacher, a neighbor, or even someone they helped in a significant moment. It's as if the reception is organized to be as comforting as possible. And there are curious accounts that reinforce this view. Terminally ill people who say they see smiling figures beside their bed, calling their name, and who describe feeling peace upon recognizing them. When we think about this, we realize that the idea of a lonely death is perhaps much more our construction of the living than a reality for those who depart. It is we who, looking at the motionless body, feel absence. It is we who project our own sense of loneliness. But if Cayce is right, the soul at that moment is surrounded by presences, by care, by an understanding that does not depend on words. This even changes how we view sad stories of people found days after passing away. Because spiritually, time is not experienced as it is here. For those who departed, it might have been just an instant until they were welcomed. Cayce also spoke of something called a life review, a process that occurs shortly after the transition. It is not a judgment in the human sense, but a clear understanding of the entire life journey. The soul reviews important moments, understands the impact it had on others, directly feels the emotions it evoked. This is not to condemn, but to learn. It's as if we receive a deep summary of our journey so that we can grow from it. Imagine an elderly person who spent their life thinking they didn't make much of a difference to anyone. By going through this review, they might perceive small gestures that profoundly touched other lives, something they might never have known while alive. This in itself is a form of welcome. Now perhaps you think, what about those who lived through profound suffering, prolonged isolation, intense emotional pain? Cayce said that in these cases, the transition is especially delicate. He spoke of spirits entrusted with creating a healing environment for these souls, as if they were received into a protected space where they could rest before proceeding. And for those who feared death until the very last moment, the first sensation would be one of surprise, not by darkness but by its absence. Death in these cases comes as a relief, as if a burden were suddenly lifted. This does not mean that the pain of life is ignored. It means that, on the other side, the priority is to restore the soul's balance. It is interesting how Cayce describes the continuity of life after death so naturally that it seems like just a change of address. He said that in the final instant, many elderly people have the sensation of waking up at home and wonder how they could have forgotten this place for so long. The explanation he gave is that the soul carries an internal memory of where it came from, but this memory is veiled while we are incarnated so that we can fully live the earthly experience. In death, this veil lifts. It's like remembering a smell or a song from childhood that was dormant, and suddenly everything comes back with clarity. And here is something that is perhaps the most comforting part of this entire teaching. According to Cayce, love is the only link that crosses this boundary intact. It doesn't matter if the person departing had no one physically by their side, all true bonds of love remain. This means that when an elderly person dies alone, what they carry with them is not the emptiness of absence, but the real and living presence of all the affections they built throughout life. And these affections do not just remain in memory, they become an active part of the spiritual experience. That is why, according to Cayce, there is no definitive loneliness on the other side. This perspective invites us to think about ourselves. If today we fear dying alone, perhaps the antidote is not just to ensure someone is physically present at the end, but to live in a way that builds real bonds and leaves positive marks. Because these bonds are not the walls of the room or the number of visitors, will be what truly accompanies us in the crossing. And according to Cayce, they determine the quality of the reunion. In the end, it doesn't matter if the exit door of the physical world opens in silence. What matters is who is on the other side to receive us? There is something in this whole vision that touches a sensitive point, our difficulty in accepting that life, even in its last chapter, can have beauty and meaning. Edgar Cayce said that to understand death, we must first understand life as a continuous process. For him, the soul does not begin at birth nor end at death. These are merely entry and exit portals. It's like a long journey where we change scenery, but remain who we are, with more or less baggage, depending on how we live. And it is precisely at this point that great consolation comes for those who depart physically alone. The crossing does not depend on the number of human hands holding ours, but on the number of connections we cultivate on the deepest plane, the plane of the spirit. This, of course, does not mean that the absence of physical companionship is not felt. On the human emotional plane, it carries weight. But according to Cayce, at the moment of transition, the perspective changes in such a way that what seemed empty reveals itself to be full. He compared this moment to entering a dark theater, believing you are alone, and suddenly the lights come on, and you realize there has always been a silent audience watching, waiting to applaud your arrival. This image, for those who fear final abandonment, is almost a liberation, because it shows us that the perception of loneliness is temporary and limited to the earthly view. One detail Cayce emphasized is that each soul's spiritual reception is carefully adjusted to its needs. An elderly person who had a life filled with music might be received by soft, familiar sounds. Someone connected to nature might perceive fields, trees, or rivers immediately upon awakening in the new plane. This is not fantasy, he said, but a way to facilitate adaptation, to create an initial environment that conveys security and familiarity before the soul fully integrates into the new reality. It's like welcoming a visitor into your home and offering them their favorite dish before discussing anything serious. And there is also, according to his descriptions, the reunion with people whom the individual might not have expected to see. Many souls, he said, are surprised to be greeted by figures with whom they had little contact in physical life, but who held deep gratitude or affection. This happens because, on the spiritual plane, bonds are not measured only by frequent coexistence, but by the real impact one had on the other. Sometimes a single act of kindness creates a stronger bond than years of living together. This is especially comforting for those who spent their last years in social isolation, believing they made no difference to anyone. But perhaps the most significant part of Cayce's vision about the death of someone who departs physically alone is what he said about the exact moment of passing. For him, the last breath is not the end point, but the turning point. He described that, immediately after that instant, the soul feels a sudden expansion, as if the space around it expanded infinitely. Physical pain, if it exists, dissolves instantly, and the mind becomes lucid in a way difficult to imagine here. For those who spent years with body limitations, such as chronic diseases or reduced mobility, the sensation is one of almost immediate freedom. Cayce said that many elderly people, upon realizing this, even express something that could be described as laughter or surprise. Not a physical laugh, but a reaction of inner lightness. And then what he called the call to return happens. Regardless of belief or religion, he said that everyone hears in some way a silent invitation to move forward. For some, this call comes in the voice of a loved one, for others in the form of music, or even as an irresistible intuition that something is waiting. It is at this point that, according to Cayce, the receivers, those who come to fetch the soul, approach more clearly. It could be a relative, a friend, or even a spiritual guide whom the person never consciously knew in life. Their role is simple and profound, to ensure that the soul does not feel fear in the instant of completely leaving the physical world. To those of us on this side, this description seems almost fantastic. But for Cayce, this was not fantasy. It was simply part of the natural order of things. He said that the spiritual world is not a distant place in space, but a dimension that exists parallel to us, separated only by a difference in frequency. Death is simply the moment when we begin to fully tune into that frequency. It's like changing radio stations. The music is already playing, but we can only hear it when we turn the dial to the right spot. And in this context, dying alone loses the meaning we usually give it. Yes, there may be no human witnesses, There may be no physical touch or words of farewell, but, according to Cayce, what truly matters, spiritual welcome, never fails. There is no departure without reception. This is perhaps the most revolutionary part of his vision, the idea that definitive abandonment is impossible. He said that loneliness is an illusion of the separated mind, not of the soul. And that phrase, if taken seriously, can transform the way we live and the way we say goodbye to others. It's also important to talk about what Cayce called the transition zone. He described that immediately after death, some souls briefly remain in a state that mixes perceptions of the physical and spiritual worlds. It is at this moment that many see their own body, observe family members around, or notice details of the scene. This is not to cause suffering, but to help them understand that physical life has truly ended. For the elderly person who dies alone, this stage is also accompanied, but by spiritual helpers. They explain, guide, and, if necessary, soothe. There is no risk of being eternally lost in this zone. When the soul finally agrees to move on, something happens that Cayce described with enthusiasm, the feeling of becoming fully oneself again. He said that in physical life, we carry only a fraction of our true consciousness, as if we were an iceberg showing only its tip above water. Upon crossing over, the entire submerged part returns. This expansion is accompanied by a broader understanding of one's own life, and even the reasons why certain experiences were lived. It is at this moment that many realize that even physical loneliness had its role. It prepared the soul to look inward, to strengthen itself in ways it might not have been able to amidst the constant noise of social life. And then, when we think of the elderly person who departs with no one by their side, we begin to see another possible narrative. Perhaps they are not departing forgotten, but rather being called to a deep reunion, to a deserved rest, to the continuity of something that never ceased. And for Cayce, this continuity is not vague. It is as concrete as physical life, just on a different plane of reality. There is no disappearing into nothing. There is moving on to the next chapter, carrying all that one is. This vision can bring us powerful freedom. Because by realizing that the crossing is not the end, and that welcome is inevitable, fear begins to lose its grip. And when fear diminishes, we live with more presence. We begin to value not only grand connections, but also small gestures, because we know that they are the true bridges that cross death. In the end, what Cayce seems to tell us is that for the elderly person who dies alone, the final moment is less about farewell and more about reunion, less about loss and more about return. Perhaps Edgar Cayce's greatest contribution to this topic is what he said about the meaning of it all. For him, the death of an elderly person who departs physically alone is not a failure of life, not a sad ending in the script of existence. On the contrary, it is merely a form of transition, and often a smoother transition than we imagine, because in the absence of worldly noise, the soul can more clearly hear the call to move on. And this idea makes us rethink something we repeat without realizing: what a shame they died alone. Is it really a shame? Or is it merely our human way of interpreting what we cannot see? Cayce described that for many elderly people, the last moments are marked by a deep peace, even before consciousness leaves the body. This peace is not a result of resignation, but a kind of pre-meeting with what comes next. He said that in this state, the soul begins to remember its true nature, as if fragments of spiritual memory started to fit back together. This is why some people, shortly before dying, change their expression, relax their face, smile slightly, even if there is no one nearby. It is a reflection of this inner reunion, not necessarily the physical presence of someone in the room. Another point Cayce emphasized is that death does not immediately erase the love we received or offered. In fact, it intensifies it. He compared this love to an invisible cord that continues to connect the soul to those who remained, but without the weight of physical limitations. For those who depart physically alone, this cord becomes even more important, because it ensures that on the other side, they are immediately connected to all the people and affections that marked their life. And here's an important detail. It doesn't matter if these people have already departed or are still alive on the physical plane. The bond is from soul to soul and therefore independent of death or earthly life. Many people fear that physical loneliness at the moment of death means total absence, but for Cayce, it's exactly the opposite. He said that the silence of that moment can be the perfect setting for the manifestation of spiritual presences, without distractions or interference. It's as if the physical world completely yields space for the spiritual world to reveal itself. Imagine an elderly person who lived for years in a simple routine, perhaps feeling forgotten by society. At the moment of passing, they realize not only that they are not alone, but that they were always accompanied by presences that, at that moment, finally become visible. This vision also changes how we approach our own preparation for the end. Cayce did not advocate for people to passively await death. On the contrary, he spoke of the importance of cultivating life in a way that the crossing would be natural and peaceful. This means taking care not only of the body, but also of the mind and spirit. It means resolving outstanding issues, forgiving and especially building bonds that transcend physical existence. For him, this was the true inheritance we leave behind. Not material possessions, but the connections that cross time and space. And there is something very powerful in this perspective. If it is true that we are all received, then death is not the moment of greatest loneliness, but the moment of greatest companionship. Think about it. When you were born, you were received by people who were already here. When you die, you will be received by those who are already there. It is a perfect cycle, in which arrival and departure are equally accompanied. And in this sense, the elderly person who dies physically alone is not experiencing a solitary end, but merely a reception that happens in another room, invisible to us, but real to them. Cayce also spoke about what happens in the first moments after this reception. He said that after the initial reunion, the soul goes through a period of adaptation, where it understands that it is on a different plane and begins to familiarize itself with its new possibilities. This period varies for each person, but for those who lived with serenity and acceptance, it tends to be brief and harmonious. For those who departed with fear or resistance, it is more gradual, but always accompanied. Never in any of his readings did Cayce describe a soul being abandoned in the process, and that in itself is a balm against the deepest fear that many carry. Another idea he conveyed is that on the spiritual plane, the concept of time changes radically. What to us seems like a long wait, for those who have departed might be just an instant. This means that even if it takes us time to physically reunite, from the soul's perspective, that reunion is almost immediate. For the elderly person who dies alone, this perception is liberating, because it eliminates any sense of prolonged waiting. Physical separation is merely a temporary impression on our part. On their side, the reunion with loved ones is already happening. And so we arrive at a central point of Cayce's teaching. Death is not the opposite of life, but its continuation in another form. He said that, just as we do not cry for a baby leaving the womb, we need not cry for the soul leaving the body. The tears are ours, of those who remain, because we miss them. But for those who go, there is something profoundly familiar in what they find. It's like returning to a place you once knew but had forgotten. For those who depart physically alone, this means that the moment of returning home happens without interruption, a direct path with no detours. In the end, what Cayce leaves us with is a message that, if taken seriously, can change how we live today. He invites us to replace fear with trust, loneliness with the certainty that true companionship is never broken, and the idea of an end with the awareness that every departure is just a new arrival. For the elderly person who dies alone, the final instant is less about absence and more about presence, the presence of those who were always connected to them by the strength of love and spiritual affinity. Perhaps this is the most important lesson. Death is not the moment we are left alone. It is the moment we realize we were never alone. And if we can live with this certainty, not only will we lose the fear of our own end, but we will also learn to honor and better understand those who have already made this crossing. What Cayce offers us is not just an answer about death. It is an invitation to live in a way that, when our time comes, we can cross over with serenity, knowing that even if there are no human hands around us, there will be hearts and presences waiting on the other side. And so instead of fearing final loneliness, we can look at it from another perspective. Perhaps it is not an emptiness, but an open door. A door that, when crossed, reveals not absence but encounter, not the end but the return.